In this section we're going to name ethers, and there's three ways of naming ethers. One is called the simple method, one is the intermediate, and the third one is the complex way of naming. Now we're going to use the same molecule and we're going to go through each of them, but essentially the most simple naming is we're going to use the last name of ether, and whatever's on either side of the oxygen molecule or oxygen atom, the alkyl groups, we're just going to call them as their alkyl group. So for example, if I had a methyl on one side and an ethyl, it would be a ethyl-methyl ether. So the alkyl is the simplest naming. The intermediate one is if I have a long chain and some other substituents on it, and ether as a last name is not going to be able to define everything on the compound, then I'm going to name the longest carbon chain, and everything is going to be a substituent, including the ether, and the ether will be called an alkoxy. So we use an alkoxy substituent on this one. And finally, the complex one is we're actually going to include oxygen as part of the chain and name it as if oxygen were a carbon, and then indicate where the oxygen is. So oxygen is part of the chain, and then we indicate where the oxygen is. So let's try it with a molecule, and we'll use the same molecule and go through all three examples. So in all three molecules we have an ethyl on one side and a propyl on the other side. So using the simple naming, all I use is the two alkyl groups in alphabetical order. So I have an ethyl on one side and I have a propyl on the other side, and that is ethyl propyl ether. For the intermediate way of naming, I'm going to start with the longest carbon chain name, which is propane, and now this becomes a substituent on the propane chain. The propane, substituent has two carbons, so it's going to be called an ethoxy. It'll be in the 1 position of the propane, so we're going to have a 1-ethoxy propane. And then finally, we're going to include oxygen as part of the carbon chain. So we're going to count up the number of carbons and include oxygen as part of it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So this is a hexane. Including all of the carbons, this is a hexane. But at the 1, 2, 3 position is what we call an oxa group. So we're going to indicate that there is an oxa group at the 3 position. So 3-oxahexane is a continuous chain with an oxygen in the middle, and we'll call it, we need to identify where the oxygen is. So we'll try it on the next two compounds for the naming. So we'll try the simple naming for the first one on the left. We have a methyl group on the one side, and we have a T-butyl. The butyl, the B comes first before the methyl, so we have a T-butyl methyl ether. So that's the simple naming. We can also go and do an intermediate naming. This is the longest carbon chain. It's a propane. So on the propane at the 2 position, at the 2 carbon, is a methoxy. So there's a 2-methoxy. There's also a 2-methyl. And it is a propane. So you can see it's quite substantially different in terms of naming, but we still, if we were to use the name to get the molecule back, both of them would actually help us out. In the following molecule, I just want to change something here. This is not a cyclic ring. The bottom is a cyclic ring, but this is not. So we'll just have the carbon come up the way. This is an ethyl group with the carbon coming up the way. And so the longest carbon chain is the cyclopentyl. And there's no real easy way to call this in terms of having an ether at the end of it, because there's 2 ether groups on it. So we're going to use the main chain as the name. So we're going to call this a cyclopentane. pentane. And now these become substituents. So we have a methoxy substituent and an ethoxy substituent as well. The E comes first, and it also then takes priority as the number 1 carbon. So we have a 1-ethoxy, and then in the 2 position is a methoxy. I ran out of room, so it's going up above here. So 1-ethoxy, 2-methoxy cyclopentane. You can see that for this one, we wouldn't be able to use simple naming to name this, and even the complex naming would be difficult. So naming the ethers, it depends on what situation you have, how you name it.